Alright, it's working now. Good morning, or good afternoon, probably if you're watching this. I'm just wanted to go ahead and record a video here because obviously I'm out, as some of you guys know, or maybe Miss Lazenby will tell you if I think she's the sub today. I am out. Yesterday, Sunday night, I woke up in the middle of the night with appendicitis, so I had to go in and get surgery yesterday to have my appendix removed. I tried to convince them to give me some hair while I was under, but they did not do that, unfortunately. But I expect you guys to work even when you're out, try to get some stuff done eventually, so it's unfair to ask of you what I will not ask of myself. So, as such, I wanted to go ahead and give you guys a quick lecture video. Obviously, some of you guys are not going to watch this. I'm not requiring it. This is just to give you guys an aid. So, for the one or two of you super nerds, I do appreciate you taking your time, whether in class or not, to watch this, try to catch up, figure out what we're doing with work. Maybe I'll do some more of these. If it goes well, we'll see. But I just want to do real quick, record the Yap Sesh, the lecture that I would normally do. Make sure you guys get this content. This way you guys can understand what we're looking at in the passage and what we're going to be doing today. So firstly, I do want to say thank you to Miss Lazenby. If she is there, make sure you say thank you. She is not a Bible nerd like this and does not do this typically. She doesn't typically have to cover for Bible people. So her having to cover for my class is very amazing, especially the way that I run it very uniquely. So I appreciate it greatly. Anyways, here's what we're talking about today is one of the cooler passages. Well, all right, every passage in here is cool, but a passage that I personally like. I'm going to try not to go too crazy on it. We're going to start, though. It is Luke, Matthew, Mark talking about the devil and Jesus. It's one of the few times we actually get this character of the devil that shows up. The devil, or Satan, is really what we should be saying, and we need to make sure we say the Satan or the devil, is exceedingly rare to be popped up by name like this in the Bible. It only occurs, actually, other than the Gospels, only occurs in Job as well, and then Romans mentions him, and Timothy mentions him, but only once does this character seem to appear in the Old Testament, and only a small handful of times in the New Testament, and not doing what we think he's doing. So we're going to look at that a little bit, and we're going to look about John the Baptist and even some mention of the first few disciples called. It is very unique what is happening here, and we can miss a lot of these moments if we're not careful. Especially, I actually was looking at some work from yesterday, and I saw some students pointed out how crazy it is that Matthew waits before introducing the disciples. Right? There's a big delay between the two, between Matthew and Luke, and so we're actually going to see as one of our differences is going to be the delay of when disciples are called and the urgency that's put on that. But the first thing we're going to see is John the Baptist. So in both of your stories, and as well as Mark, if I was in class, we'd be reading Mark chapter 1 out loud together. And in all three of these stories, the first thing that has happened is John the Baptist. Now, if you were reading Luke last class, you've already seen some of his birth story. I believe it's Luke talks about him, really likes him. Whereas the others don't have as much of detail. Right? We don't have this leaping in the womb. We don't get that he's a relative, anything like that. They seem to bypass it for other information. And part of this is that John the Baptist is supposed to show that, hey, he's coming to fulfill the way, coming to prepare the way of Jesus. But he's going to do that by being something, by showing a little model of what Jesus will be, right? And Jesus is actually going to echo some of this, which is unique when Jesus echoes something and follows along somebody else's story. Is kind of quite the strange thing. But John shows up as this term, it's called an itinerant preacher. So we should, if you are taking notes, this is something to write down as itinerant. I-T-I-N-E-R-A-N-T, itinerant preacher. Now, we'll talk about this theme a little bit because we do see it, especially in Acts. We see it pop up. But itinerant preachers are another way you could say this is wandering preachers. They're these guys that show up, typically have pretty radical beliefs, and they're all over the place in first century Palestine. They are wandering around telling people what it means to live a good ethical life, whether this is ethical for Judaism or first century Roman paganism. And Roman paganism was everywhere, right? Jews don't have to follow it. They're the only people that are not legally required to be pagans. But there are itinerant preachers preaching some of this all over the place. So John, and even when Jesus shows up and does this, is not out of the ordinary. What's out of the ordinary is the things they accomplish. What we see for John is that he is out baptizing people, but he's not just cleansing people and just giving them a bath. What he's doing is actually saying, I will mark that you are part of this group, and I will mark that God's forgiven you and prepare you for Jesus. Somebody else will come. And so Jesus comes and is baptized in the way that John is baptizing, and then is going to end up taking this over. And we get to see one of the things, and I'm going to try not to go into a long tangent on here, but we actually see some pretty big differences even in this story. We're going to see some different emphases. The first thing, when we see the baptism of Jesus, Mark has this famous saying where he says, we see the dove and we see all this stuff, and we all get this saying of this is my son in whom I'm well pleased, right? But Mark actually, there was a period in Christianity where people took this and they looked at Mark and they actually created this false belief called adoptionism. Now, adoptionism is a heresy or a belief that disqualifies you from being a Christian. That 12, well, almost 2,000 years of church history have officially said, if you believe this thing, you're not a believer. You're not following Christ as the triune God. And I'm not saying Mark teaches this. What I'm saying is Mark is easily misunderstood to be saying that this is where Jesus becomes God's son rather than always was. Right? So it's this idea that Mark, at this time, there was not a lot of talk about the Trinity. Not yet. And there's not argument about it in this way. And so when Mark writes this, it was one thing, right? I'm sure his followers had their beliefs about it. It was fairly simple, or maybe not simple, but understood. It was not well developed, is the term we'd like to use. By the time that Matthew gets to this material, what we're going to see is that there were a lot of heresies at this time. There was adoptionism. Nobody really understood how to do the Trinity because at this point Jesus has died, and they're trying to figure out what exactly do we do with Jesus has died and been risen again, and he was saying he was God's son, but we saw these things. We can't reconcile it. So Matthew, one of the goals that he has, and this is kind of in addition to showing that Jesus is expanding the kingdom, one of Matthew's theological goals that he is going to actually do is to build out the Trinity and to show a very high view of the Trinity. This is one of the ways that as scholars we date and figure out when was Matthew being written, because the things around the time of Mark were not emphasizing the Trinity so much and did not have these advanced build-outs, we call it, of the Trinity, meaning they were not having such a high value of the Trinity to this level. And Matthew instead is going to start using Trinitarian language, meaning God is triune, God is three in one. It's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, co-equal and co-eternal, three parts in one, right, of the same substance. These are going to be the ideas that start being built out in Matthew. And this is the first time we see it built out. Matthew is trying to combat the heresy of adoptionism as well as others. Even modalism was one, right? Modalism is another heresy, and we see it. Still, some churches have done this, but we see it in language of Jesus as God, or God as Jesus, right? It's the idea that Jesus is God, yes, but there's no God the Father at the same time. That God only takes one form at a time, a different mode, right? There's different modes of Jesus. There is at work Lang, and then he exists, and he's one type of person, right? But when I'm home sick, I'm sick Lang, and I'm not work Lang. It's modes, ideas. So these are the things that are happening around Matthew that he is combating. He's saying, make sure we prioritize these views. right? These are some big views to prioritize. And we're going to see from here as well that we also get a mention of asceticism. And so we're jumping from the Trinity to another type of wandering preacher. I think today's book, you guys will have seen some of these words already, but you're about to see it even more. And we're about to get to it with Jesus going to the devil. So talking with the devil. So we really have to talk about ascetics. Now this is spelled Ascetics. Ascetics. Asceticism is something that we don't have a ton of in modern America. There are still people that practice forms of this, like fasting or something else, but asceticism was at the time a very common practice of getting spirituality, and it is here's a good quick definition of asceticism. Asceticism is the intentional depriving of fleshly pleasures or fleshly comforts, even not even just pleasures but comforts, in order to attain spiritual growth. So the intentional self-depriving of fleshly comforts in order to attain spiritual growth. Now, many ascetics would not only do things that would deprive them of physical comforts, they like eat bad food or something like that. They would also intentionally make things worse for themselves. The idea being that they are punishing the flesh for its fallenness, but also making this by discomforting the body, you can make the spirit more comfortable and more open to receive God, to receive the spiritual. This is what we do when we practice fasting, right? We practice fasting still. We're about to go into Lent. We will pretty soon, once we celebrate Easter. We're going to spend 40 days where you're supposed to sacrifice something. This comes out of this, right? This is part of this asceticism. And they were also all over the place. A lot of the itinerant preachers maybe were ascetics, or the ascetics, there would be people that would do small ascetic practices weekly, or as we read in the Shadow of the Galilean, and we're about to see with Jesus, there were people that would actually go out into the wilderness to live their lives, possibly forever. Some of them were famous for digging holes that they couldn't get out of and living their life in the hole. That's it. They were just in the hole. That's it forever. And they would trust for other people to come feed them. And they would give them wisdom back, and they'd say, we'll tell you about some wise stuff. But we're just in the hole. That's it. That's where we live now. And it's quite a strange thing to us, but they did it. There was one guy that lived on a column. It's like a 20 or 30 foot column, big post, and he just lived up there for his life. Or people that would weld, they would get like big chunks of metal and put it around their neck so they could never properly lay down. So they would always be uncomfortable and relying on God to comfort them and their spirit and provide for them. And we see that John the Baptist is one of these people. As scholars, we believe that he was, and the hints, of course, are his details of clothing that we get. Some of these books, we're going to get details of clothing, and it's specifying he was intentionally living uncomfortably, right? We get that he had a very careful diet, so his clothing, camel skin, camel fur. Camel fur would have been very itchy. It's not normal to wear that, right? To wear camel skin. It's showing that he is a wilderness guy. He's just wearing very simple, very rugged clothes, but it's very itchy, very uncomfortable. And so he's being constantly reminded of a need for God. So he's living an uncomfortable life just every single day by wearing camel fur. It was a mark of a lot of these ascetics. The other thing that he's doing is living a diet of honey and locusts, honey and bugs. Now, it was not abnormal for people to eat that. Even in parts of the world today, it's not that abnormal to eat these two things. But what is abnormal is subsisting almost entirely on that for your whole life. Right? You can never be full if this is what you're eating. Yeah, you're getting the nutrients mostly that you need, but you're not filling yourself, and you are constantly scrounging and hoping to find more. A locust is actually something that is actively destructive and marks that there's famine. So you are actually eating something post-famine, right? You are a famine plight either. It's just this whole different thing. It's this whole different difficult life. And they would go live in the wilderness intentionally to do this, trying to get closer to God and know him more. And we're going to see this theme pop up in Shadow of the Galilee, and we're about to get in that book to the Essenes, which very excited about this section of the book. And these guys that did this asceticism, and they practiced it intently. And it was believed by some of these groups that this is who the Messiah would be. They said, the Messiah will be this. The Messiah will be like us. Right? He's not going to be of the flesh. He's going to be an ascetic. So when John is wandering around, and he is an itinerant preacher, right? Surely the Messiah is going to be a preacher and give wisdom. And he's an ascetic. And he is saying, do not focus on the flesh, focus on the spirit. They're saying, yeah, maybe this is the Messiah, right? People are confused and they're asking, is this truly the Messiah? And he says, no. I wouldn't even be worthy to untie his sandals. And this is something that the only person that would ever untie somebody's sandals would be a slave, not even a disciple of the closest person, because feet were nasty, right? It was so disrespectful. And he's saying, I am so low, I couldn't even do this. So he is fulfilling the prophecy of preparing the way in the desert, right? He's literally in the desert, in the wilderness. And he's fulfilling this prophecy. Behold, one comes to prepare the way. So this is John's role here. And John is going to show, this is what you think I am, right? We've seen already, we saw the Maccabees at the beginning of the year. We looked at them. We thought maybe Jesus will be like this, coming with a sword and violence. And then we're going to see this other model of this itinerant, ascetic preacher. And it's maybe Jesus will be like this. But we're going to really start getting Jesus today. And we're going to see that he does go out to the wilderness to practice some asceticism. Matthew and Luke say that Matthew says he fasts for 40 days, but Luke does not say that. He just he spent 40 days not eating. Mark just says he went out to the wilderness. So I want to talk about each of these. These are the ones that I'm really focused on. I know I'm going over time a little bit here, but I'm about to, but we'll do what we can. So Mark is the first to do this. Of course, he's writing first. And when he does this, the first thing that we need to notice is he says the Spirit was upon him and pushed him out in the wilderness. Now, in the Greek, the word is euthus. It's immediately, right? It's this urgency. It's this like grabbing of Jesus and rushing him out. Jesus didn't get a say in Mark of if he's going out in the wilderness. He's thrust out there. And which is rapid. And it's kind of how Mark speaks and writes, but it's showing that Jesus has an urgency to his message. And he's going to go out there. And then when he goes out there, Mark says he is tested by, he goes out for 40 days to be tested by the Satan. Now, in the English translations we have, and most popular translations in modern America, they drop the definite article there. So definite article meaning the, and they just put Satan. And we think of it as just another guy, or a being, right? We think of it as this ancient spiritual being. When in fact, when it has the Satan, we should be looking at what does Satan even mean. And the word Satan, or the Greek is so devil is the Greek version of this, and we'll talk about that in a second with Luke. But when we get the Satan, what it's saying is the accuser. Now, the accuser, as I've mentioned, shows up in Job and other places, and he was common as a common belief among the Essenes and among Kabbalah. And among these Jewish traditions, they practiced them, these Jewish traditions of ascetic people, especially, right? The Essenes are we're about to meet them in the Shadow of the Galilean. It's really cool, really crazy people, but they really believed in this accuser character was out in the wilderness tempting people. And this accuser, as they talk about it, it's not just a name, it's a job title. So it's actually this being that counsels God, which is quite crazy for us to think about, right? But he was on the heavenly council in the book of Job and others. And this idea is that God is sitting as if he's in a courtroom. And God in the courtroom is there above us to judge us. That's one of the things that God does. And the Satan, the accuser, plays the role of a prosecuting attorney. So if you don't know what a prosecuting attorney is the person bringing the charge of sin against somebody. It's the person trying to convince you that they are wrong. Now, his role, Satan, was not only to accuse you, but to get you to actually do it to prove it. He'd go, well, I can prove that they're going to do it, so let me prove it. So when Jesus goes out to the wilderness, what Mark is doing, he's going to show the mystery of Jesus, right? Remember we talked about the theology of the mystery of Jesus, and he's going to look and go, is he just another ascetic? Right? We're setting up as, is he just another one of these guys? What type of Messiah is he really? It turns out he's such a great Messiah that he was able to be tempted not just a couple days, but he's able to go out and live in the wilderness for 40 days being tempted by the Satan himself, the accuser, the guy whose job it is to trip you up, right? Because it's a job role, not just a being. It's his job is to trick you. That's who Mark is saying Jesus can get past them. And this is very important then for the way that Matthew and Luke build on this tradition and build on this idea, right? Because when Matthew gets to it, he's going to be the first one. He writes first. He's going to use Mark, and he's going to add on to it and show us that this is not just as simple as Jesus going to the wilderness and feast and fasting, right? He's showing this is the preparation of Jesus' ministry, is what we like to see it. But we also see this dramatic, almost court case play out. You see it again in Luke, but we're going to look at Matthew first because he is what's first. We're going to see this court case, and I'm going to give you a spoiler alert here, but Jesus comes out innocent. And in Jesus' innocence, he actually is starting to redeem Israel. Right? We talked about these theological themes of Matthew redeeming Israel, building out and undoing their sins. So Jesus actually is going to undo their sins in our court case. So the first thing that we're going to get, Jesus is echoing manna, right? He's hungry, and the accuser, the Satan, says, make some food out of stones then, Jesus. Go ahead and do that, my guy. And he says, no, I'm not going to. Right? He says, no. And he quotes scripture back to him, points back to him and says, absolutely not. So we get Jesus' identity as being challenged here. And if you want to do the reading that I put online to help yourselves, it's amazing. It's a very good devotional reading as well. He points out that he's going after Jesus' identity, and Jesus says, no, I will not do this. Right? This is like he's taking the role now of Moses and Israel, and he's looking like it, Moses and Israel, right? One day for each year that Israel was in the desert, and the first thing that they struggled with and were tempted by was food because they thought they were going to starve. Right? So Jesus is there for 40 days, echoing the 40 years that Israel wandered in the wilderness. That's important detail. And that Jesus is saying, no, I'm not going to beg for food, and I'm not going to do this. Now, the next thing in the book of Matthew, we're actually going to get here, we get different orders in the book of Matthew and Luke. So remember, we've talked about the idea of contradictions. And if we look at the Bible incorrectly and go to it wrongly, they're contradicting because we're assuming that it's going to be telling exactly the facts and that's all it's doing, that it's not playing out these dramatic stories, right? That there's not these intentional tweaks and changes to grow and challenge us theologically. The writers are doing important things. And Matthew, what he wants to do, Matthew is going to follow along with Israel, and he's going to actually show, let me see where I had. The first thing that Jesus does is he gets taken to the Temple Mount. He gets taken to the Temple Mount, and first we have Judaism is being represented. And Jesus is being shown, you can be in charge of the Jews if you want. And Jesus says, no. Right? He's taken to the Temple Mount. This is kind of what's showing. And he gets told, throw yourself over. Throw yourself over and prove that God will provide for you. Now, Israel, when they're in the wilderness, wanted God to provide. And they had these struggles, and God did provide, right? But they didn't trust him, and they didn't have faith, and they sinned against God in these ways. They said, we don't trust that God will provide for us. So Jesus says he will provide, but I'm not going to test him. No. But here's our big difference. The next one is that Jesus then gets shown the whole kingdom. Now, there's obviously some hyperbole here because and Matthew is like, oh yeah, he takes them to a high mountain. There's no mountain in the world where you can see the entire world. The world is round. Couldn't even do that if you wanted, right? Can't see all the kingdoms. What it's representing here is that Jesus goes here and the Satan says, how about I give you everything if you just bow down? You get everything. Jesus says, no, absolutely not, and denies it again. Now, here's why Matthew is putting this at the end of this story. Here's what happens here is he's saying that he's focusing on the expansion of the kingdom, right? We have built out slowly and slowly Jesus' identity. It goes all the way out to everything, right? We go then to Judaism. It's a very intentional thing of building out everything. That Jesus is the new Moses wandering in the desert, and at the end of it, the focus is on everybody, all kingdoms of all the earth, for all time. That is what Matthew focuses on. And this is why he's going to try to do this. He's going to expand outward. Now, Luke, on the other hand, is going to look at this and he's going to say, okay, I'm going to do this same court scene because very good that we've started this, and the first time we see this tradition was Matthew, but Luke is going to alter it. Luke flips these last two. He starts with Jesus' identity, but he flips the last two. So he actually has him be offered everything first, and then from there is going to flip it and say it's at the temple, right? Because Luke, his central pushing and theme, kind of the place of tension for Luke is the temple. When he's writing this, the temple's been destroyed probably about 40 years ago. In our the estimation for our class is that Luke was written around 110. So Luke is writing 40 years after the destruction. And he's got to respond to this because the temple is such a core thing for their identity. So what Luke is doing is trying to make sure we know that our identity, the Jewish identity of a follower of Jesus, is now in Jesus, no longer the temple. Right? We're going to see this temple theme show up over and over for Luke. We saw that Jesus, the first time Jesus was heralded as the Messiah and announced, was in the temple. And now Jesus is actually showing more tension at the temple. Right? The temple is a central theme. So Luke is going to do this intentionally, and this is our big difference. These are our big differences today that we should really be focused on, is how are they furthering their goals? Well, Luke is showing that we don't need the temple, we need Christ, right? That Christ fulfills it without the temple. Matthew is showing that Christ, the Messiah, goes out to everybody and expands it. And Mark really wanted to emphasize that Jesus is more mysterious and more than just these other teachers, right? There's more happening here. We're going to see more because Mark likes to be simple. We're going to see that there's more to be held, more mystery here. So those are our big three differences. Go ahead. Thank you guys for your time if you did sit and watch this. If you have questions, please email me. I will try to do my best to respond. I'm still recovering, but please do your best on this work. It's a lot of reading, a lot of writing. I know you guys can do it. You've been great so far. Thank you.